When examining Japan's relations with the West refers mainly to America and some European states, especially the Allied majority such as Britain. From 1912 to 1941, there is a trend of relations turning from good to bad. When World War I broke out in Europe in 1914, Japan honored its commitments under the terms of the Anglo-Japanese alliance and entered the conflict on the Allied side. From this, there is evidence of support and cooperation from Japan towards the West. When the war ended in 1918, Japan was given a permanent seat in the League of Nations Council. Thus, Japan was accepted among the Western powers and relations were at a high. However, racial discrimination towards the Japanese were one of the factors for the deterioration of relations before World War II. In 1919, at the Paris Peace Conference, Japan's proposal of amending a racial equality clause to the Covenant of the League of Nations was rejected by the United States, Britain and Australia. In 1924, America passed the Japanese Exclusion Act to shut off Japanese immigration into the US. A series of conferences and treaties also brought about mixed feelings in Japan. The Washington Conference of 1921 strengthened relations for and enabled Japan to enter into a fuller collaborative relationship with the Euro-American powers. From Japan's perspective, the agreement at the Washington Conference carried significant benefits such as recognition, naval parity in East Asia, and the ability to keep its empire intact. Japan desired good relations with the advanced nations of the world, especially Britain and the US, to allow economic expansion and security in case of war. However, the military in Japan opposed the 1922 Washington Naval Limitation Treaty, which resulted from the 1921 conference. They believed that the 553 battleship ratio was detrimental to Japan's security, and so the incident bred resentment of the military, which would impact Japan's relations with the West later. The London Naval Conference and Treaty in 1930 similarly imposed naval restrictions on Japan, which were deemed unfavorable to them. There were mixed sentiments in Japan, but the cooperation between Japan and the West eventually continued. In 1934, Japan expressed an intention not to extend the treaties past the 1936 expiration date and began planning on the super battleships of the Yamato class. Japan effectively abrogated the earlier pacts and in 1936 withdrew from the London Naval Conference. She had already withdrawn from the League of Nations in 1933 since she was heavily criticized for her actions in China. Hence, Japan's relations with the West were disintegrating very obviously through her refusal to collaborate with them. Besides Western provocation, Japan's actions also impacted relations with the West, especially the US, from 1931 to 1941. From 1931 to 36, Japan clearly violated several treaties and invaded Chinese Manchuria in 1931 and Johor in 1932. Japan also renounced naval treaty restrictions in 1934 and signed an anti-Comintern pact with Germany and Italy in a show of unity between the three powers who were deemed most committed to threatening world peace. Although the Western powers, Europe and the US in particular, were unhappy and threatened by Japan's actions, the US thus far took no formal action or only delivered verbal warnings against each action. However, concrete actions from the US were seen from 1937 to 1938. When Japanese aircraft attacked US vessels in the Panay incident of 1937, the US demanded a formal apology. 1937 also saw the US starting an economic war against Japan, who was economically reliant on the American market. From Howe's proposal to the start of US sanctions, the US showed strong opposition to Japan's aggression in China. In 1938, the US loaned $25 million to China to fight Japan, and in 1939 there was a formal embargo of aircraft and parts to Japan. Japan resorted to attacking European colonies in Southeast Asia, such as those of the Dutch and British, to obtain resources. Obviously, Japan's relations with the West, in particular the US, was hostile by this point, and Japan viewed the West as the enemy. The US also actively opposed Japan's actions. Any remaining diplomatic ties were being severed, such as the Japanese-American Treaty of Commerce and Navigation signed in 1911, abrogated in 1939 by the US. An increasing number of Americans saw the Japanese as dangerous and self-deluded oppressors. Although Japan had strong relations with Germany and Italy, these two nations were viewed as misfitting and evil by the rest of the Western powers. 1941 was a crucial year for Japan and the US. Negotiation using Howe's four principles were an attempt to restore relations, but that failed and led to the freezing of Japanese assets in the US, the total embargo by Britain, the Netherlands, New Zealand and the Philippines, and the dispatch of US fighters and bombers to the Philippines to protect it against Japan. Japan proposed the East Asia settlement in 1941, but the US rejected it. Increasingly, the US was getting more solid in its stand against Japan. Within 10 years, there had been a drastic change in foreign policy towards Japan, reflecting the worsening of relations between Japan and the West. By November 1941, it became clear that a satisfactory diplomatic agreement between Japan and the US was impossible due to conflicting interests. This was what led to the 1941 Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. Hence, this is the story of how Japan's relations with the West were destroyed.